Hi, welcome to Writing and Thriving with Sally-Shakti Willow, and my guest today is Christine Thomas. Christine is the author of a forthcoming book, and we've been working on that project together for actually a number of years. So, Christine, welcome, and tell us about you and your book.
So I'm Christine Thomas. I'm the author of The Elephant in the Room. Is weight loss worth it? As Sally-Shakti said, it's a book we've been working on for 2 or 3 years now, and it's finally come to fruition, which feels amazing to have it finished and written. It's a book really that charters my journey, um, my weight loss journey, my struggle with my weight, and it really tries to answer three questions, which is essentially why do we believe that we have to be thin to be happy? Why do we think that diets are going to provide that answer? And if that's the case, why do inevitably women regain the weight that they lose, like I did? So I try and answer those questions through the lens of both my professional experience as a health economist, but also my own personal struggles as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, trying to juggle, career and family and everything else that goes along with the inevitable aging that we all go through.
Well, thank you, Christine. I love what you said there and your clarity with those three questions, beginning with, the big one, really. Why do we think we have to be thin to be loved and to be valuable? And I know that's where really one of the premises of the book really began with that question. And you weave your expertise, your professional expertise into your personal experience. So we've got this beautiful transformational non-fiction book where you're working in your professional expertise, your personal experience, and your approach to teaching people through yoga and mindfulness as well. Do you want to talk about some of those threads and the way that they weave together in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I felt that I had sort of a unique perspective on it because my day job really looks at what happens in real life. So we often study interventions like drugs or healthcare, in a clinical trial setting, which is a very controlled environment. And what I try and do is to look at what happens when those products or those interventions go out into the real world. How do people cope with it? Much the same way as when you're on a diet and you're following a program, it's all well and good, but then the minute you come off it, it becomes a bit more difficult. Or the diet tells you to do certain things which don't really quite fit with your life in reality. Maybe it's the timing of the eating, maybe it's the fact that you're also trying to feed other people, or maybe it's you just don't have access to those, ingredients or those recipes. So I'm kind of looking at it with professional lens, but I'm also looking at, why is it that as, somebody that understands this and has done this for many years, why do I keep going back to something that hasn't or has worked but hasn't worked in a sustained way for me? And what makes us, draw back to that as, and why do we feel as women that we need to be thin in order to be accepted? I felt it was the one area of my life that I just couldn't conquer. And then, as you say, I draw on my experience also as a children's yoga teacher and a restorative yoga teacher to think about how we can actually tune into our own bodies and come back into ourselves and tap into the inner wisdom that we hold within, rather than this idea that everybody else knows what's best for our body.
Absolutely, and you really uncover, those premises throughout the book. Especially thinking about how diet culture and magazines and social media teach people to depend upon external authority and external advice and information for how we should live and how we should eat. And you really bring it back to that much more centered and embodied and holistic approach to self love, self worth, and self compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important message because as women, I think we feel under pressure to look a certain way. As you say, this isn't something that's new. It's been around, even since the 50s, women were told that, being fat was unacceptable. And I think especially in this day and age now, we've seen the advent of the sort of, new diet drugs. People are sort of venerating slimness as some kind of a measure of a success. If you can lose weight, you're successful, and if you can't, then you're not. And I think it's really important important that we don't always look outward for the solution to our lives, because we're the ones that live in our bodies. We're the ones that have to live with, how we're feeling, not just how we're looking. And I think just switching over from that idea of that external look to the internal feel was a really important point in my journey.
Absolutely. And so let's think about that journey that you've been on, the wider journey and also the book writing journey. I'm really curious to ask you, how did the book writing journey really become part of that transformation for you? How did it help to change your approach?
Well, I think, I when I thought about writing the book, I had a very kind of clear ideas of the themes that I wanted to include in the book and what I wanted to say about them. But I have to say, it has been a journey, because that evolved and changed along the way. And I did as well. And I think, recognizing that when you write a book, that is almost part of the healing process for me, was actually writing the book and going through those different iterations. And, there were times when I really struggled with writing, because I had to kind of be quite honest, on the page. And I think there's something about writing, or something about seeing it written down, that makes it become real. It's not just a concept, it's not just an idea. And it actually putting the words on the page really helped me clarify what my struggles were, and how I felt about them. And I think that's the key thing when you're writing a transformational journey. It's not just about what happens, it's about how you feel about what happens along the way. And that was a lesson I think that you really helped me develop and bring into the story, not just telling my story, but understanding how I felt about it and how that changed as I went along the way. And I think when we started writing the book, I mean, obviously the structure and so on has changed, over the last couple of years. But I think also I couldn't ever really get to the end until I'd actually written the book. Almost that was part of the journey to get there, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such an alchemical process to write the book. And you mentioned about, putting the words onto the page makes it more real. It's like there's something energetic about putting the words, I say, getting the words down and out and putting them onto the page. Suddenly they become a bit more separate from you, because they are now outside of you. They're more externalized. So your thoughts, ideas, stories, feelings, emotions become more externalized. You can see them. So there's a bit
Yeah.
more objective distance, but they have to move through you. They have to move through your consciousness. You have to feel them and allow them to be present, give them space. All these things I speak about with the writing practice. If we're trying to push away the truth, or I'm not saying that you did this, but in general, if we're trying to push away or avoid or conceal the truth, even on the page, then we're not allowing those thoughts and feelings to actually move through us. And when they do move through us, when we really do get the words and feelings down onto the page, we create that objective distance so that we can see the words, the stories, and the parts of ourselves with more compassion, become the witness to our truth and deeper layers of our truth that we might not have been acknowledging before. And when we can allow that truth to exist as it is, and not trying to change it or force it to be something else, that's actually what creates the space for that story to transform within ourselves. And I want to kind of bring that back to your book, and think about the layers of vulnerability that you moved through in writing the book, and then also thinking about, often those layers of vulnerability are really important for connecting your reader to your story, because that's where you can meet them where they are. They're feeling that vulnerability themselves, and so if they can see it in you, then they can resonate with your story. They don't just want the finished product, the finished outcome. They want to resonate with, are you able to empathize with how they are feeling now in their journey?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point. I mean, I think it is about writing it and putting the words on the page, but I have to say I felt it was a process that almost took over, my life. I would be walking around and it would be going through my head. I was dreaming about it. These thoughts were kind of rolling around on my head. And then having that space sometimes gave me greater clarity then to come back and say, aha, that's what I need to write. That's how it fixes. And it helped everything kind of fall into place for me. I mean, I tried to bring in some humor into my book because I look back at some of the ridiculous situations, but actually they were sometimes some of the more poignant moments as well. And I think recognizing, making the links with your own experience helps the reader perhaps consider theirs. They might not be the same links, but it helps them understand that, you know, there's a reason behind this. It's almost like peeling off layers of an onion, really, and seeing that, oh, okay, so what led me to that bit? Okay, so what brought me there? Okay, so what happened there? And I hadn't really joined up all the dots when I started writing the book at all until I started writing it, and I started to see these links that they kind of emerged and became more clear to me as I went through. And I think being able to take the reader on that journey of them emerging rather than just saying, oh, this is the answer, this is the fix, this is the solution, which I think a lot of sort of self-help books try and get you to the answer before you actually realize what the problem is. And I think people genuinely want to be seen and heard, and they want to feel seen and heard. So it's quite a quest really to try and see your reader, but that's almost what you have to do in writing the book, is to see yourself and then they can see themselves.
That's so beautifully put, Christine. And I think you're right, and you couldn't have created a book like that where you're trying to give people the answers, because that's exactly the opposite of what your message is. Your message is for people to connect with themselves and
Yeah.
find that self-love, self-awareness, self-acceptance within themselves, not to have answers put on them from the outside. So your book has to take people on their own inner journey. And like you said, the way you do that, you support them through that, is actually by sharing the parts of your journey that can meet your readers where they are in their personal journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very vulnerable, place. I think at the beginning I hadn't included a lot of my story, and you'd said to me, well, what's your story in this? And I had to go back and write that and realize that, of course it's not everything that's all happened in my life, but it's the things that I've recognized now, making those links between, things that have happened and how I felt about them. And even being able to kind of almost transport myself backwards to how I felt at that time, I think helps the reader then feel how they are feeling perhaps right now, and acknowledging that rather than trying to, as we so often do, we want to just brush over the pain, brush over the difficult moment, let's get to the happy place. Actually, we get to the happy place by just releasing and letting go of those uncomfortable moments.
Absolutely. And so maybe talk us through the drafting process, because there is some technicality to this. When if I'm coaching somebody or encouraging somebody to write their story for the book, often the first draft, the first round of the story that comes through is for you. That's your healing journey, that's your healing story. That's not necessarily for other people, it's not necessarily for readers, because it's the part of the process where you're still working through your story for yourself. How did you so then we redraft. We write on the first draft, we write the story exactly as it is, in all its messy detail and vulnerability. And of course, a lot of people are scared to put that on the page. They don't want to be seen at that level of vulnerability. But the next step then is to work with that, edit it and redraft it so that it becomes something that is available to others. It still holds the resonance of that vulnerability, the storytelling, the compassionate witnessing, but it becomes a story that is in a way safer for people to hold in where they are in their story, and also makes more sense to people because because by the time you redraft it, you've also now done a level of integrating of that story so that it becomes a story that you can share with others. Can you talk us through that process?
Yeah, so I think the first draft, you're right, it's quite a raw thing, really. And I think what came across in my writing was it was quite critical. It was quite self-critical of myself, and the language that I used and so on was sometimes quite negative towards myself. And I think in the redrafting process, I thought, well, how is this working for me? And I could see that that wouldn't be the kind of way that I'd want my children to speak to themselves, or my friends to speak to themselves, or my readers to speak to themselves. So that kind of really helped inform how I was talking to myself, which was hugely healing for me. But also, it then I think made the book be a bit more compassionate, and the next round therefore had a bit more, it was a bit more positive in a way in terms of actually drawing on things and being able to move on from experiences rather than dwell in them, which I think was hugely helpful for me. And to recognize, the acknowledgement to me is always the first person part of any kind of transformational healing, is acknowledging what's going on. And I think that's probably the hardest part for most of us, because we don't want to go there. And I think in the first draft, you have to almost go there, and you have to acknowledge to yourself what's going on. And then in the next draft, that almost becomes, it's kind of the healing then self-perpetuates, because you've gone through that acknowledgement. You can then move on from it. So it was a massively important stage for me, not just in writing the book, but also in my own, transformational journey, in my own healing process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes that's why writing a book takes the time that it takes. Sometimes when we're really working at that deep level, we're going through that transformational process um, in real time, in order
Yeah.
to bring something through for the readers that is, I also feel like when a book calls us to be written, it's also calling us into the next level of our identity. But writing the book is what helps us to
Yeah, there.
embody and become that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, there's this line about writing from the scar, not the wound. But actually, to get to the scar, sometimes you need to write about the wound, and that is how you make that leap. It's not as simple as once you're sorted, you can then write the book. For me, it wasn't that experience anyway, which is why it took me as long as it did, because I think I was still on that healing journey. And I think wanting to write the book was my acknowledgement almost of saying, I want to sort this problem out. I want to heal from this. And therefore I had to write the book to get there. So that was part of it for me. It was a huge, huge part.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said. And I'm just thinking back through our journey, and one of the places we started with the book was, you mentioned your professionalism. Your method of writing was much more geared towards academic and scientific.
Yeah.
How did you begin to evolve that more sort of cold, objective, distant, and it was more critical way of writing into something that had more heart and openness, vulnerability, and was more, could be more accessible to your readers?
Yeah, I think when I first started writing, I felt like I had to back up everything I said with a reference, or I had to validate it somehow. And I think you said to me, you don't have to prove that you're feeling how you're feeling. You can feel that way. It's okay. So I think actually moving into writing about how I was feeling rather than just about, the events was a big step towards being able to write in a more compassionate tone. And to invite my reader in more, because I think that felt more welcoming in that sense, rather than just, as you say, writing it from an evidence perspective and looking at what we can show and what we can demonstrate and how we can prove it. And I think actually witnessing my own journey along there was a really important part of the story. And I think as I wrote the drafts, more and more and more story came out into that, and less of the data and the facts. As interesting as some of those are, I think it was putting them through the lens of my personal experience. And I think one of the things that came through with you was to lead with my story first, and then use those as the examples rather than the other way around. So that was a big shift, I think, in between, I think, drafts 2 and 3.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just wondering if you could share with us one of your stories now, something that maybe just comes to mind, or feels like it would be relevant to bring through.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key kind of themes through my life and the book, was two issues really. This kind of almost obsession like relationship I had with sweets and sugar because I wasn't allowed them as a child, and I'd always thought, oh, I love them because I wasn't allowed them, and it wasn't until I started writing the book and writing my story that I kind of made the connection with the fact that sugar had been used as solace for me as well, not just in terms of, people had given it me in times of grief, like, I think I recall in the book the first time I was given, some chocolate was at my baby brother's funeral, and when I fell off a horse, I was allowed sugar in my tea. So I had these links that I made through writing the book. But I also then recognized, drawing on my yoga practice and the more somatic aspects, was that actually my body had stored that memory, and that was the response when I wanted comfort. That's why I was so drawn to sugar and stuff. And it was making those links all the way through to actually recognize, okay, so actually I need to go back to my body rather than trying to use my mind to, willpower and say, oh, you need to resist and you shouldn't have those and have that reproachful voice. It was saying, okay, how can my body learn to cope without drawing on that? And how can I feel better in my body? And that, in a way, was a big sort of gateway to my journey, really.
Oh, I think that's really, really powerful. And I think a lot of people will resonate with that as well. And I'll let people read the book to really get into the depth of those stories and the some of the suggestions and solutions that you work through and that have worked for you. What do you feel are your next steps? Because we just completed what probably is more or less the final edit. What are your next steps, and how are you moving forward with the book so that people can um, read it and access it?
Yeah, it's in its final stages. I've just been speaking to the editor this week, so we're hoping to have it submitted for publication next year, which is really exciting. And just getting, those refinements in there, and as you know, it's an ongoing process publication. But getting that done, and then I'm hoping to be able to do some more kind of work so I can invite people in. So I've got a community on Facebook, the Table Tribe, to invite people in. So there's a space that people can come and share their own experiences. It's a really vulnerable place. I think weight for a lot of women is a very sensitive issue. And I'm really mindful of the fact that people find it difficult to talk about it openly. And I want to make it okay. There's, to be able to talk about the struggle that we have rather than this judgment that, over people's size that we see on social media so much. I want us to just stop commenting about it and start to understand how we feel and why we feel that way. And hopefully that helps us heal our own relationship. And we don't have to make these comparisons with each other all the time.
That's so wonderful and so needed, and also so generous for you to create that space for people and for women especially. And I do think your book becomes part of that conversation because you share
Yeah.
your vulnerability, you share the vulnerability of your stories, um, and it doesn't have to stop there. We don't have to get stuck in the vulnerability because there is, there are ways through, or at least there are ways to embody and integrate how we feel about ourselves in a new way, in a new and more positive way. And for your book to then become part of that conversation that creates a space and gives permission and invites people, women, to share their stories and share their vulnerability in what is, I'm guessing, a private community space, so that it's a
Yeah.
safe space as well. It's a contained space. I feel that's really valuable and important.
Yeah, I think it is important, and I think, I'm hoping to do more kind of practical classes with the yoga and so on as well to help people learn these techniques to try and, not feel that yoga is something that you have to be stick thin for, or, you have to be super bendy and flexible, but it's more about connecting with yourself and actually letting people feel that they have that power to sort of take control of their own bodies without having to feel they have to follow all this, expert advice or scientific advice that doesn't really take into consideration the pathways that we've laid down during our lives, because that's what our body is actually responding to, not, what the guidelines say. So I'm hoping to move that dial a little bit in terms of that kind of embodied experience as opposed to just that cerebral knowledge that we rely very heavily on in this Western world.
This is so amazing and so powerful. So, Christine, where can people find you? How can they join your community, and where can they find out more about the book?
So the best place to go is christinemthomas.com. That's my website, and you'll find links on there to the Table Tribe and to my newsletter, which will let you know when the book is published and also keeps you up to date with my journey and what's going on.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. People can find me at writingthriving.com or on Substack and social media at Writing Thriving. And I'm so grateful for this conversation and look forward to more again in the future when the book comes out.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.